I'm Hydroplane. I'm a member of DC 801, the hackerspace in Salt Lake, the group. So I've been going SAINTCON as long as Pope, but I haven't accomplished near as much as he's done. But we've presented here a few times, and it's interesting. I started out technical, and now I've become more interested in some of the organizational parts of security. You find eventually that organizational problems cannot be solved technically. So, talk about our agenda tonight or today. Control sets. Probably a lot of you understand what a control set is, but in case you're not familiar, we're going to go into the larger idea of a control set. Then we're going to talk particularly about the CIS Critical Security Controls. And then part I'm actually most interested in is our conversation after that. There's a lot of control sets help you, but there are challenges associated with that, and I want to have a conversation about some of those challenges. So if we imagine a scenario, you work for a company, and the boss someday, you're technically smart and interested in a lot of things, and someday they realize there's bad things, there are bad people out there, and they need to do something to protect themselves. So they come to you, and I want you to protect us from the bad people. And if you've not really dug into this, is this kind of your first exposure? If you're Pope and they say, "Oh yeah, PCI," and you know that what you don't know is your position, right? You probably start asking yourself, well, what do I need to do to protect my organization? And in 2021, there are a lot of people who have asked that question before. And that's where we get where control sets basically come from. We're going to talk about some popular ones. How many, and if you raise your hand, how many of you work in an organization and you implemented ISO, the 27000 series? Okay, so a few. ISO 27000, it's proprietary. Like you actually have to pay the company or the organization that owns it to be able to have access to the controls. Now, it's very popular, very trusted, if you are doing business with a company that's in Germany and they ask you about what type of controls, or you say ISO, they nod their head. They understand what it is. And ISO is good. It does have a lot of controls. Pretty much any need you have, you can find in ISO. Some type of control that to implement. Another control is NIST 800-53. Who here works for the federal government or a company that does business with the federal government? Okay, then you will probably have been at least exposed to NIST. The government it's a large organization, and they established a control set they want to be implemented within the organization. Another control set also from NIST, which really it's a little different than the other control sets, but the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's relatively recent. Is initially targeted towards critical infrastructure, like you think electrical, utilities, things like this. But the reality is it can address other areas. How many of you have at least looked at NIST cybersecurity framework? Yeah. It's relatively new, but actually, has gotten a lot of traction. Then we're going to talk about the one we're talking about today. You'll notice I put the number of controls next to some of these. And you notice that there's only 18 controls. And we're going to talk about why it's so compact compared to some of these other ones. And some other ones, there is Secure Controls Framework. There are over 800 controls in the Secure Controls Framework. And there's a few others, sketch, a few others like that. So there are a lot of answers. If you want to find a list of things you can do to protect your organization, there's a lot you can find. Now let's talk about the critical security controls. It starts in 2008. SANS, which how many of you have attended a SANS course some point in your career, right? Very popular, high quality training, they started it back in 2008. You may have heard the term consensus audit guidelines. Kind of a mouthful. A lot of people call it the SANS Top 20. And even today, a lot of people are thinking it's the SANS Top 20. In 2013, they kind of handed it off. Council on Cybersecurity had it for a bit. And then 2015, so about 6 years ago, it got handed over to Center for Internet Security. Now, throughout this time, up until version 8, which is what we're going to talk about, it was 20 controls. And that was kind of the thing that everyone understood. This time, they've reduced the number of controls. We'll talk about that. So basic ideas that drive why the critical security controls are structured the way they are. First is everything's written in blood. Every single control, they can point to something that went wrong that this control could have either prevented or mitigated it. Which means we're not talking about theoreticals like the aliens come from Mars. It's all very practical. It's all very real world. Another thing, and this is part of why we have a limited amount of controls, is the focus. They cut out. They understand, and a part of the critical security controls is they understand people might have limited resources. What do you do that actually makes a difference? And that's part of why the critical security control is really small compared to some of the other control sets. Feasible, very, very practical. I would say we're going to look at some of these. There's some parts of these controls which I think would still be a challenge for some people. Measurable. After reading a control, you're going to know if you're there or not. They're very easy to evaluate whether you're meeting the requirement or not. Align. I think yesterday during the third vendor security class that was the next track, they said there's about 90% overlap with all the control sets. That's true. The critical security controls are not going to do anything that's radically different than you're going to see in the other control sets. We're just very focused to help you, not spend your energy. You only have so much energy. Focus on these things to protect your organization. So the highlights of the changes. In the past, who here has spent some time with the previous versions of the critical security controls? Okay, a fair amount. So in the past, they used to say, this is your priority. Do your basic, do your foundational, do your organizational. And that was how you sequenced your work. That's gone. They entirely got rid of it. They added implementation groups in version 7, which is the previous major version. And now they're pretty much, the implementation groups is going to guide how you implement. So another thing they've added, and part of this will actually help you understand how they could get down to 18 controls from 20, is they added a glossary into the latest version. So if you know that critical security control number 1 is inventory and control your hardware assets. Now they don't say hardware assets anymore; they say enterprise assets. And because you use a term that kind of covers more, you don't have to say network assets and hardware assets. There's enterprise assets. So that goes to that consolidated some of the controls. In the past, you had two secure configurations. You had basically like endpoints and network infrastructure. Now you just have secure your enterprise assets. They got rid of boundary defense. I think there's been people, I think 5 years ago at SAINTCON that said, your perimeter doesn't defend you anymore. And, so no longer think, as long as I've got my firewall, I'm protected. That the world has changed from that. Another thing they've added this year was actually service provider management. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the SolarWinds issue. I mean, probably, you might know more about it than me, but I mean, whoever you work with, whoever you share resources with, if their problems can become your problems. And adding this control being added is a reflection of that. Does that make sense? And then they've resequenced some things. It used to be, I think, secure or vulnerability management was number 3. Now it's I think number 8. So let's talk about probably one of the things that you really need to understand the thinking in version 8, and its implementation groups. So implementation group 1. The idea here is that you're a small business. You really don't handle anything particularly sensitive. You may have somebody that's like tech smart, but you may not even have a dedicated IT person. And so, with this in mind, you're probably not distributed. The person in your organization can stand up from their desk and see all the computers that belong to that organization or the organization's using. What I'm trying to do is paint a picture that we're talking small company, small org. Now, and probably that 4th item, the commercial off the shelf. You can probably go to Best Buy and buy all the equipment you need to outfit your organization. Now, because of that, when we talk about some of the later controls and go into detail, you notice that like network monitoring, they really can't network monitor effectively with just the consumer grade equipment. And basically, the whole goal of the controls and implementation group 1 is you're not low-hanging fruit. You're not doing something obvious that if simple things could have kept from happening. So that's implementation group 1. Now we go to implementation group 2. Group 2 is a big step up. At this point, we're assuming that you actually have like dedicated IT people. Like you have a person, and that's what they do for you. Is that. Now you're also the complexity. You may have like multiple departments. You may have different leaders in different places. I don't think I'd honestly say implementation group, you might consider distributed. I know it's the COVID world and distributed is a thing. But I mean, distributed might be a challenge for a group that's like implementation group 2. Now, they might have some regulatory burdens, but I don't there's going to be, when we talk about implementation group 3, in that space, if you do something wrong, not just your organization is going to suffer. And by this point in time, you're buying like enterprise equipment for your business. Now, this is an important thing. If say you're an IG2 group organization, right? But you're going to start with implementation group 1, which isn't a bad thing to do. I mean, you're getting off the ground. Please buy enterprise grade equipment, because if you buy commercial off the shelf stuff, then you're going to turn around and basically have to buy enterprise equipment. So, that's a key thing, is if you're going to kind of like, I'm going to do implementation group 1, then I'll do 2, make sure that you're not wasting your organization's money by having to, and having to replace your equipment. Implementation group 3. You're actually pretty industrial at this point, and you should be reasonably mature. You're touching some sensitive information that, let's see here, the 5th bullet item, significant external impact associated with successful attack. So say Equifax, right? If they get attacked, there's a significant impact on people that aren't even customers of the organization. So I'd honestly say that if you are touching sensitive information, I'd say that, I know some people like to minimize their obligations and the things they have to do. I get it. But if you're touching sensitive information, you really honestly should be implementation group 3. And by this point in time, you might not say you can protect against 0 days, but you should be able to mitigate or control the impact associated with something like that. So implementation group 3 is all the other implementation groups plus 23. Now these 23 controls, they might, not all controls are created equal. These 23 actually require significant organizational, technical resources to realize. So even though you may, 23, trust me, the 23 has some significance. So we're going to look at some details. We're not going to look at every safeguard because we don't have that kind of time. But I'm going to point out some key ones that are probably going to be a challenge that you're going to have to figure out. By the way, the URL, the CIS, actually whenever someone talks about CIS, they want someone to give a link to the source documentation. So if you want to go back, that's this link here. So here are the controls. If you're familiar with previous versions, 1 and 2 really is no change. Data protection moves up, secure configuration moves up. They kind of reorganize some of the controls, like account and access control, which always kind of go together. Vulnerability management actually drops down from the previous version. You have some familiar controls. And then I'd say actually the one that's kind of new is service provider management. So with that in mind, let's look at the different controls. Again, we're not going to look at every safeguard. Each line here is a safeguard. So you have control and then safeguards underneath it, right? So, like only 2 for implementation group 1. And even if you had like no enterprise resources, you should be able to execute it. Now, that being said, even if you're implementation group 1, you may actually want to go enterprise on some things because you'll help you cope, and you're expecting to grow at some point, right? So, nothing too much here. Implementation or control 2 is interesting. Look at the ones and you nod your head, but when you get down to those bottom 3, authorized software, okay, there's controls for that. Authorized libraries, I know a lot of people that would be a big challenge. And that's implementation group 2. And then implementation, the very last one, which IG3 is even scripts. You'd control scripts on your systems. Those 3, they're doable, but the thing is, you're going to have pretty strong control of your environment, which is not a bad thing. But a lot of people coming from organizations that are trying to up their game, this will be a challenge. I might ask right now, is anyone would say, let's go with 2.6, the authorized libraries. Who here in your organizations would struggle to get that implementation, that control in? A lot of people. Thank you. Yeah. The statement was, even if you did, how many examples of hijacked libraries are there? Yeah. yeah, I mean, you would probably need some type of hashing or signature work. So the thing about it, that's some work. And, you know, I'm calling out these things because, you know, like a lot of the stuff, yeah, I got it. This, I'm going to have to work for it. Data protection. Again, a lot of this reads like it makes sense. Honestly, I'd say that more than technical, that organizational challenges exist in protecting your data. Like, you know, like a lot of these things, they say you should label your data based on its sensitivity. But who here, you know, works in an organization that should, but doesn't label your data based on its sensitivity? Thank you for being honest. Appreciate that. But hey, I've been okay if you didn't. But you know, I'm pretty sure you are not alone. It's a challenge because, you know, to a certain extent, it requires a certain amount of rigor that sometimes workplaces and cultural interests may try to avoid. When we continue, if you look at you know, data flow diagrams, you know, how many of you have ever spent any time in your career developing software? How many of you, like maybe in college, got like you had a class where they taught you about data flow diagrams? Okay, you know. How many of you who wrote code and did have a class on data flow diagrams actually produced data flow diagrams when you're developing software? Okay, one, right? Yeah, you know, because to a certain extent, a developer kind of views their job is to write code, and this is kind of a distraction. But I mean, more mature organizations where you have to understand where your sensitive data is going and coming, you know, this type of thing allows people to understand and therefore protect their data. Encrypt at data in transit at rest, pretty normal. You know, an interesting thing is the log sensitive data access. In 2013, there was the Snowden leaks, right? And the NSA and the big story of the year, basically. And I'm curious, I mean, I'm hoping that NSA logged access to their sensitive data. I'm just curious if they did have that in place, what they saw was being accessed. I bet it was really uncomfortable to say. Okay, secure configuration, next. A lot of this, you know, you're going to nod your head and yeah, you know. When you get to the implementation group 2 and 3, you're going to talk about, say for example, have remote wipe on portable end user devices. How many of you in your organization should have MDM but don't? Okay, a few honest people. Again, thank you. And that thing is, you know, it's not just for security. I'm pretty sure your IT department is working twice as hard as they should because they don't have it, right? Means a lot of things that are good for security are also good for your IT department. That's one example of that. But basically, the last 3 controls. If you don't have endpoint management, good luck. And I met an IT manager once, and we had an argument over we need to have IT endpoint management. And they're like, oh, no. And eventually they came around to me. But, you know, it's like, you know, I was trying to help him. But yes, endpoint management, if you don't have it, please look into it. Besides security, especially, how many of you in this COVID, your organization's gone remote or distributed heavily? A lot of people, right? And again, endpoint management, mobile device management, same thing. This will help you secure your organization and service your organization. Account management, basic stuff here. You notice that implementation group 1, we're not asking them to centralize it. Again, we're assuming they're small. and not distributed. Because the moment that you're distributed or big, not centralizing account management is a nightmare. How many of you have ever been in a case where you didn't have centralized account management and it was very frustrating? Okay, yeah. So, access control, very close to account management. And a centralized access control. I'll ask the positive question in this case. How many of you have some type of system that basically like a single sign-on within your organization that most of your services, not say all, but most of your services use? Yeah. That is infinitely better position to be in than not to have that. Because say you have an employee that leaves under not good circumstances. With centralized account management, turn them off. And not saying you have no problems, but your problems are reasonably controlled. If you don't have that, then you have your IT and your sysadmins spending the next 2 hours trying to find everything and turn them off. Yeah. And define role-based access control. This is probably the truth of the matter for a role-based access control is a harder organizational lift than it is a technical lift. Because a lot of organizations, especially small ones, they play hero. Like in the soccer game, the kids' soccer game, how everyone just chases the ball around and nobody plays any of their positions. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right? What happens is they kind of like that. They like heroes because they're young and that. Eventually, it ends up hurting you. Eventually, you have to kind of have different people play different positions and control access based on that. And I honestly, you think, we could implement a technical solution. You need to get the organizational part. You need to spend some time with your HR and your business leadership and help them understand this. Continuous vulnerability management. This used to be number 3, bumped down. Not that it's not important, but some things got in front. A lot of this is going to sound pretty straightforward. Yeah. Well, number 8, audit logs. Now, notice one interesting about this is initially for implementation group 1, you're not trying to centralize audit logs. We're not asking you to do that. Again, we want this to be achievable by the organization. And understand that they're limited on expertise and resources. As long as you have logging turned on, we'll call that good. One thing about it is also they're not expecting to deal with sensitive information. So while it's important to have this turned on, it's not so critical that we pull it all together and use a SIEM and things like this. Now, a very interesting thing, because a lot of the things you'll look at here and make sense, maybe the command line audit logs might make you a little uncomfortable. But the last control, which is implementation group 3, is service provider. So who here maybe uses Okta? My organization does. Okay, it's a good solution. You can, if you integrate with Okta, have them send their data into your SIEM. And even though a lot of this is have all your data go to a SIEM, when you get to that really mature organization, we even want to try to pull data from our partners into the SIEM, which is a different challenge than doing the other work. Email and web browser protections. I think a lot of this makes sense. The last one where it says deploy and maintain email server anti-malware protections. That type of thing is basically, how many of you have an email sandbox in your organization or know what an email sandbox is? Okay. The idea is that your email, attachments will actually be opened up in a virtualized environment, handled or manipulated and be assessed for maybe the risk it proposes to your organization. This type of resource is, third parties will provide it for you, but this is what they're talking about with that type of control. Malware defenses, the one I would find very interesting is 10.5, enable anti-exploitation features. Everyone knows AV and everything. A lot of your systems are not by default hardened as they could be. Another thing from the Center for Internet Security, they have benchmarks. How many of you have ever heard of a STIG? You probably touched the military at some point or something. Anyways, it's a baseline, like things you can do to enable or disable features to make your systems more secure. When your 10.5 is kind of talking about that, things like, say, address space, location randomization, and things that help your systems maybe not get hit by a buffer overflow attack, things like that. But I would, this control looks like I just need to run AV. It's also, let's harden your systems. Data recovery, this is a very interesting one in the sense that implementation group 1 has to do pretty much everything that the other group has, with the exception of we're not going to expect you to test it. Network infrastructure management. Again, for them, they're commercial off the shelf for implementation group 1. So all we're asking them is keep your stuff up to date. That's it. All the extra work, which seems pretty there. And then we go to monitoring, and you notice that we don't expect implementation group 1 to do any network monitoring. But we're assuming they're on consumer grade equipment. So it'd be asking them to do something, and they don't touch sensitive, or at least I hope they aren't. And then there's more. One thing you're going to notice, and I'll go back here, in implementation group 2, you have a lot of intrusion detection, but when you go to implementation group 3, they're talking about intrusion prevention. So you actually have active controls in place protecting you. Not just something bad happened, but protecting you from something that went bad. Security awareness training. Honestly, we need humans to get things done, and the problem is that humans, the attackers know that humans are a risk to our organization. Now, they can also be very good. They can be great sensors, but they're probably the most targeted part of your organization. So, all the training. And the only thing that they were not expecting, like less mature organizations to do, is have role-specific security training. Now, an example, which you might actually encounter in this space, is how many of you work at an organization that has like point of sale, where you have consumers come up and they swipe cards? Okay, not too many. Okay. But PCI actually wants you to train those people to inspect the devices like daily for skimmers, things like that. So that would be an example of particular security awareness training you'd have for certain people in certain roles. Service provider management, this is a new control. And if you're implementation group 1, all you do is just have a list. At least you need to know who your service providers are. Now, if you get to a point and you're dealing with sensitive information, now you're actually like assessing them and paying attention, like every year audits. How many of you have third parties that almost on an annual basis will have you fill out maybe a survey and have someone come on site? I expect that's going to increase. The risk associated with a lot of that. Now, notice for application software security, which is interesting here, is that kind of the assumption that if you're a very small organization, you're not doing any in-house software development. Now, I know some small organizations. How many of you actually worked for a small organization, like, say, 10, and you actually had some software development in that organization? It happens, right? Yeah. But I mean, in this model, we're assuming that, if you at the point that you're writing software, you are at least implementation group 2. So I know some people would probably want to be well, we'll just worry about implementation group 1. We're small. Well, once you start going into a certain space, the expectations go up. So now, interesting thing I say here is implement code level security checks. So things like static software, static application security testing. How many of you actually have software development in your organization and you're doing static application security testing? Good. And like dynamic application security testing, both these type of testing, you should have somebody kick the tires and see where things fail. You'd rather have someone that worked for you do it than someone that didn't. Incident response. This is interesting because in the past, before implementation groups, you would have actually told a small company, don't worry about incident response. But even implementation group 1 has some incident response or obligations. Now it's basically like we'll identify, we know who we need to talk to, and we tell our people to report things. That's not heavy. But later on, especially when you're complex, especially when you have sensitive information, incident response becomes a thing that you have to have. And the last control, we only have 18 controls now, not 20. Last one is the same one you've seen before. And basically, pen test. And, the thing about this is, once you reach a certain level of maturity, once your organization has the potential for a certain type of risk, then we have to deal with, we have to have pen testing because you're always being pen tested. It's just whether or not they work for you, right? So with that in mind, this is the part I'm most interested in. There's some issues I want to bring up because this is a challenge. When I've looked at this and been in places, I've seen challenges in this space. So which implementation group matches your organization? The challenge I've seen here, and actually we have a mic available if people want to comment on this issue, is your organization has limited resources, or at least they have a preference for utilizing limited resources for security. But they are actually really should be like an implementation group 3. When you assess the sensitivity of what they're doing, the complexity, they're distributed, everything is telling you they should be implementation group 3, right? But you're talking to your leadership, and they say, well, we think we're implementation group 1. And that's a challenge. Who here has had that type of challenge? When you're working within your organizations. Okay, a few of you, yeah. And that's honestly more than technical challenges. That can be one of the bigger challenges that you'll have. One thing I've learned, and what I'm in the process of working through, is this: get buy-in. Whatever you're going to do for security, make sure that before you really push within your organization, you get whatever senior most element in your organization and have them agree and sign off and policy it, and because if you don't, you will find that once you start pushing and it becomes uncomfortable in some ways for some people, that you'll lose. But if you've got organizational buy-in, leadership buy-in, you're in a lot better position once you encounter those situations. Okay, this is, how many of you've gone along, you're getting some stuff done, but you come up on a control and you just know your organization's going to struggle with it? Yeah, there probably should be more hands up for that, but thank you for those that did. Yeah, thank you. This is going to happen. And here's an important thing to understand is that there can be, besides security, there can be other things that could end their organization. If they don't make money, if they don't have money at the end of, if they have more month at the end of their money, and they have obligations, and like payroll to pay and all this, they may be willing to accept a security gap because with the resources being what they are. At that point, I mean, I know we don't like gaps. We're a security conference, but like as long as your job, you can be comfortable as long as they are fully informed and they understand the risk they're accepting. At that point, they accept the risk and the gap. Make sure, kind of get them on the hook. Make sure they kind of put in writing what we understand, and we're choosing not to do the thing right now. Just because they say no now doesn't mean it's no forever. You can reapproach it. Maybe some news story opens that door. Maybe they get, they're willing to go ahead and do it now. What should you do first, second, third, and fourth, right? Because there's a lot. Even the critical security controls, which are really trying to compact things, is still a lot. What I'd say is, once you've identified your implementation group, trust the sequence that the controls are put in. That is an approach where you can manage it. You're not trying to do too much all at once and can't get anything done. An interesting thing, a thing that may incentivize your businesses is this year, the state legislature passed a law that basically said that if you're following like best practices, and they actually call out the CIS Critical Security Controls as one of those. Well, if you have an information security incident, that's going to help protect your organization from certain types of legal risk, which is good because a concern is, if you spend resources, you kind of want to get value out of that. And they're basically trying to carve out and say, because you do good things, we're going to treat you a little different. It's weird because when you have a security incident, a lot of times you're the victim of a crime. But how often do you feel like you actually somehow committed a crime when someone compromises your organization? It's inverse. So they're trying to shelter it. So if you want to sell to your organization, hey, critical security controls. We want to do this, and it will help our organization. You might pull this one up. And we're about 7 minutes before I'm at the end. I want to open this up. Are there concerns or questions or even comments that someone wants to make on the topic that we've been discussing? I know it's all been me. If you want to raise your hands, I think we have a mic available. Okay, please, he's over here. I'll repeat it for the recording. I'll just kind of summarize what you said is, there's a lot of work that goes on, but really management doesn't see it and doesn't really see the significance associated with that. Is that a good summary? And, the thing about, interesting thing is like IT. As long as all the computers are working, they're almost invisible. But the moment it breaks down, you're screaming for IT, right? There's a security company is one of their slogans is "We make nothing happen," which kind of speaks to your point there. And so you have to communicate value. If you're a technician, all you have to worry about is conducting vuln scans, remediating vulnerabilities, pen tests, network auditing. But if you're in leadership in information security, a big part of your job is helping explain the value and significance. And it's not an easy job for what you just said. It is a challenge. Does anyone have things they've done that maybe helped address that?
So we work in a heavily regulated financial industry, and one of the challenges, I shot both of my hands up there when you said, have you ever struggled implementing any of these controls, justifying it to the business? We're on path just in this next quarter to finally implement a CMDB for 1.1. And I think where we found the leverage and the way to influence those managers and those executives is in the metrics that the information security team and the operational teams can gather on the controls that they implement. So as we started gathering and implementing a control assurance program into our security program of the bank, we're able to reach out and say, okay, this control and this control and this control, we have API connections into all of them, and we can pull all the asset information down, and we can say, comparatively, we should have X number of assets, but we're only seeing half of that in this control, and we're only seeing 3/4 of that in this control, and we're only seeing this and this. And so our control assurance metrics that we were reporting up to the management teams were abysmal. And when we showed how little of coverage our controls actually were and how much money they were investing in these controls, they were seeing that their ROI wasn't being met, and thus the push to now centralize all of our assets from all of these controls into a CMDB. So think about how you can tailor your metrics to show that they're just wasting money by checking a box to say we're secure.
Appreciate that. I appreciate it. I have to speak business to business people, right? And metrics, yeah. And that's the thing. Please say there's more comments out there, please. And we're about 3 minutes. I want to give the next person that's coming in behind us a chance. So there's one or two more, and then we'll go.
Okay, just real quick. Is there a prioritized approach or some risk ranking associated with each of the results, when you...
So the priority, that's why they sequenced these. Like the sequence of these controls, they really should do inventory first, and do these. They want you to follow this sequence within your implementation group. That's the guidance that's being given generally. This is very generally. Your specific situation may cause, you might have reason to change some of the sequencing. Does that help? And one more, and then we're gonna need to go.
Yeah, so this is kind of more back to the question of how do you make management, aware of what they need to do and prioritize things. Never waste a good incident, I guess, is a good way to put it. Yep. The unfortunate reality is that typically when you're up at midnight, 2 a.m, trying to decide where ownerships of assets are and what data is on there, that management suddenly realizes, oh yeah, we got to get some of this in place. So.
Yeah. Good. I like that. That's really good use. You should not have a traumatic event that you don't leverage to make your situation better, right? All right. One last slide, and then which is, let me get down to it. Is I want the conversation to continue. So on the SAINTCON Discord server, there's a channel, CIS Controls. And what I do is every day I put one safeguard in there, or like if we're reaching a new control, I'll go with the control. And the benefit is we're able to look at each one of these controls and safeguards in isolation, which helps you kind of have a discussion on something very focused. So if you are interested, this is increase your interest in this area, please get on this SAINTCON Discord channel, Discord, and then CIS Controls Channel, and follow along and contribute, make your comments, things you're struggling with, things you found at work. Both are welcome interests. So with that, thank you for your time, and have a good SAINTCON.